Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK, and today's show is about public affairs and comms in times of political upheaval. UK politics has been an eventful place in the aftermath of the May 7th elections. Labour's terrible performance has prompted the first serious challenge to Keir Starmer's leadership since he took office. We've had ministerial resignations, we've had will they, won't they stand, we've had rumours, gossip, crowing and blaming from different sides. What we don't have at the time of recording is certainty about where this will all end. Now, we won't be focusing on the latest twists and turns, as it will be out of date pretty quickly. Instead, our guests will look at how this period and periods like it affect public affairs and political comms and how the industry should approach it. So we have a stellar trio of experts today. Damion Potter is Executive Chairman, Public Affairs in the UK at H Advisors. Welcome, Damion. How are you?
Good, thank you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Emily Fermor is a partner at Hanbury Strategy and chair of the PRCA Public Affairs Professional Board. Hi, Emily. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. And finally, Fraser Raleigh is MD, Public Affairs and Government Relations at SEC Newgate. Are you well, Fraser?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Good to see you all. So I'm going to dive straight into the questions. So first off, how do you describe your workload, really, since the post-May elections crisis began?
Well, firstly, I guess it's better to be busy than bored. And it's been an intense period. I would say it's been an intense period globally in 2026. We have, as part of a global network as H Advisors, been doing a lot of reporting on Davos, NATO, President Trump's tariffs, relations with China, but particularly Israel and the US's bombardment of Iran and the Strait of Hormuz and the response from Iran and the impacts on the global economy. So already writing about those things for our clients has been an intense period. But domestically, obviously, over the last 2 weeks, it's been incredibly busy as well, as we've been helping our clients to navigate the local elections, the fallout of those local elections, the runners and riders that might become or want to become Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer and his policies. And at the same time as those things happening, we've been onboarding new clients, we've been working with clients that we already support, and trying to navigate a King's Speech. So it would have been a busy week anyway with the King's Speech and 35 new bills that the current government want to push through Parliament. But with the local elections and the fallout from that, it's that triple whammy of having clients that want to know things that are happening in a period of global change and at the same time as having domestic change and pushing legislation and regulation through Parliament if they can, on which most parties actually agree with the bills that are going through Parliament. So that part's stable, the elections and the domestic part within Labour perhaps less so.
Yeah, absolutely. And Emily, have you been had a similar experience?
Yeah, for sure. Look, it's been a busy year all year, but at times like this, when politics is unfolding right in front of us, there's an urgency and an excitement to the job. I think it's been really heartening to see our teams really get into it. Like, I remember when I was young, we had, lots of excitement in politics, and that really gets you into the role. And it's been a huge pleasure to see them so excited by it. I think in our jobs, we're privileged to talk about politics all the time and every day. And it really doesn't get much better than this when so much is unfolding.
Great. Fraser, same to you, really.
Yeah, I think similarly, the workload has been pretty intense for quite a long time now. I think the thing that's changed since May is probably the work streams more than the workload. So we're certainly noticing quite a growing appetite from clients and parts of our network to try and explain to them across the breadth of local to national and then on to international public affairs what's happening in politics. So our local team, and particularly demand to talk through the impacts of the local elections. And I think particularly at the moment, as we're entering the period where all the councils are having their AGMs and they're starting to form their cabinets and have leaders appointed, combining that in with navigating Labour leadership, King's Speech, as Damion says. So across the local to national breadth, there's a lot going on when there's a lot of client demand to try and understand it. And I think one thing that's quite striking in the Prime Minister's speech last week, last Monday, when he was talking about how he saw the challenge ahead, he said these are not ordinary times. But I think actually for public affairs professionals, they have been ordinary times for quite a while now. And we're starting to wonder whether or not this kind of cyclical uncertainty and this change is actually a symptom and not a bug.
Interesting. New normal in a way.
Perhaps.
It'd be good to sort of drill down into maybe some specifics about the kind of things clients have been looking for in particular in this period of uncertainty. What have been the kind of main requests that they've put to you? Emily, would you like to go first?
Yes, I can jump in. So I think for me, it's two things. The first is insight. So beyond what's in the headlines in the newspapers, really what is going on? Who are the personalities that are making moves? What's going to happen before it becomes public knowledge? And we're really fortunate at Hanbury that we have a partnership with our sister agency, Stack Data Strategy, who looks at public opinion polling. And so really looking at public sentiment at a constituency level, what does the likely outcome of the by-election in Makerfield, what is that going to be? Does the Burnham bump mean that he is likely to take a seat that is so out of bounds or seemingly out of his grip that the Reform are more likely to win? So they're coming to us for insight. They need advice on how to action that, though. So what does that mean for my media relations in such a crowded market? Do I need to change the timing of my media intervention or which journalists we're going to speak to? So it doesn't just have a kind of read across to public affairs strategies, it has a big impact on how you're communicating more broadly too.
Yeah, so probably three things. Firstly, they follow the news and therefore they come to us to see how does it impact on their business. And we don't try as consultants or in-house specialists on public affairs to try to beat the news, but we do need to follow it enough to recognise where our clients might be anxious. And that's down to the policy questions. With the current government, people know what the current government wants to achieve because they've been in power for 2 years and they set out their stall. With some of the new potential candidates or prime ministers within the same government, those policies could shift. So we know that in utilities, for example, one of the main stories in the news today is whether Thames Water, that those who'd want to buy it would still be interested if it were to become a Burnham, Streeting or Angela Rayner-led government. If you're Heathrow Airport and you've stuck closely to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, will the third runway be something that would go forward with a new leader? Those are policies that would really shift the business for them. Secondly, our clients want to talk to us about scenario planning. So they want to know, should they pause? Should they go now? Sometimes there's an opportunity with new candidates to flesh something out that was previously paused or going slow through government. So there is an opportunity as well as a risk. And then thirdly, it's trying to look much further ahead at stakeholder mapping. So which people will stay, which people might leave, which people might move into different positions of power. And on that side, it's trying to look beyond national governments, but also looking at regional mayors, regional policies, particularly devolved administrations, as we've seen changes there in the local elections, and civil servants who stay in the jobs, regardless of which party is jostling for new leadership or positions ahead of elections.
Interesting. You've had a similar experience there, Fraser?
Yeah, I think clients want to get confidence from us that we can see the whole picture and that we can connect it into them, what it means for them. I think particularly thinking about the local and the devolved and the national picture, they expect us to be able to understand Westminster and explain what's happening at Westminster, obviously, and that's fast moving at the moment. But they also expect us to be able to talk to them about what a new Plaid Cymru government in Wales means, how the new MSPs in Scotland are acting, what it means to have green councils in London on the scale that we do. People on the ground who already got day-to-day experience of dealing with some of these people who may be in positions of power. So we've got a team in Manchester who can talk to people about what it's actually been like to engage with Andy Burnham as mayor and some of the institutions around the regional mayoralty. And then thinking about things like what councillors are actually thinking about and how they're starting to behave. So we're at UK Reef today launching our National Planning Barometer, which is an annual survey where we report back on what councillors on planning committees are saying. So it's kind of never-ending, more whack-a-mole than it ever has been before. But clients expect us to be able to talk about that, not just for its own sake. And as Emily says, we're all personally interested in politics and take an interest in it. As Damion says, we don't want to try and get ahead of the news. So we need to be able to talk about politics in a way that fits within wider corporate affairs strategies and that supports commercial objectives.
Yeah. So, I mean, it must be difficult at a time like this, or I assume it is, to know exactly which SPADs, civil servants, politicians themselves to target. Are you finding that it has been a bit of disruption on that level as well?
Yeah, I think the people don't always necessarily change, but the context does. And I think we need to remember that with any form of public affairs engagement, you're fundamentally trying to talk about who the right people to try and build relationships are and how to influence them and understand the noise that's around them. So I think you have to understand the context that we're in, where the distraction might be, where there's less attention than there was, whether people are moving to more tactical thinking rather than strategic things that need really significant political buy-in from across the Parliamentary Labour Party, for example. And I think particularly being able to read the tea leaves of where the things that matter within political parties that don't necessarily rise to the surface, even on kind of day-to-day political reporting, where you have to understand where the influences are, what people mean when they say certain things, what happens at this political factions conference over the weekend and how it relates into wider things. Because I think we all know from engaging with politicians that there can be a little bit of doublespeak or a little bit of subjective meaning in some of the things that they're saying that we need to be able to understand and translate.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? A lot of the nuance that, is one of the reasons why consultancy such as yours kind of exists, really, is presumably all the more important when, clients want to get to the meat of what's happening pretty quickly, I would have thought.
So I think it's the nuance. It's also trying to have that bigger picture, as Fraser said, that strategic look ahead at how these things might shape out, and an in-depth analysis, as Emily said, on the policy, because we enjoy it. Not everybody in business does enjoy it. Lots of CEOs are frustrated or confused by change. They were frustrated when I worked in-house at ESPN and Disney and worked in-house at Glaxo and span out Haleon. Often CEOs have come from the finance side or the marketing side, and perhaps have touched the sides of PR, but rarely have they looked at public affairs. And so when they're working in this market, and there seems to have been a continual chaos since Brexit of changes of leadership and spads, and that business have less time to meet them to talk about their business needs, it does mean that longer term projects can get parked by them. I do think that as well as nuance and strategy, people look to us for those networks. So we, like lots of other agencies, have people that are aligned to all of the different 5 main parties in the UK, from Greens to Labour to Liberal Democrats, Conservatives and Reform, and across the 3 devolved administrations in Ireland, Wales and Scotland. And having those relationships help us to do more stakeholder mapping with the resources that we have than a company might expect to do. Being able to go to all of the party conferences this year will be more important than ever before. And having previously been in-house attending the Conservative and the Labour Party business days were a great opportunity to network and to access, but also speak about policy. This year, Reform have smartly, I think, set the price of theirs at about 1/10 of the main 2 parties, if we can still call them the main 2 parties, which will mean there'll be more businesses going to their event if they become the government in 3 years from now. So they're thinking differently in ways in which they want to engage us and engage business. But business, they want stability. They want to know longer term will their investments last beyond the people who are currently in power. And that's why, again, coming to the civil servants as well as working with spads and ministers is so important.
Yeah, I could well imagine. I mean, do you think there's an argument to put quite a lot of lobbying on hold, or is that effectively what would happen a lot of the time anyway when there's such a kind of sense of flux? And how frustrating is that, or is it just part of the game?
I think Fraser was right in saying this is a feature of the system now, not a bug, and we should expect a level of uncertainty and change to just be part of the daily workings of government. I think if we look back to the last 10 years, we haven't had a Prime Minister serve a full 5-year term since David Cameron 2010 to 2015. And so we should expect a level of change. I think what that means for those working in our business and working in our industry is 2 things. First is readiness. So I think in crisis communications, people talk a lot about being prepared so that when an issue arises, you are well equipped to adapt and respond to it. And I think that's true in policy influence too, and making sure that you are really abreast of, okay, what does a certain political party mean for me? What is a certain weakness in my relationships that I need to shore up ahead of change? And then the second thing is consistency of message, right? We've talked about the network and the breadth of relationships being important across politics, across Whitehall, in devolved parliaments, as well as in local councils. Well, if at least you're resonating and you're applying the same consistent message, your message isn't going to be misconstrued at a point of change when you could be potentially in a more vulnerable position.
And I do think it's striking how quickly we have had to change our mindset back to where it was before, sort of maybe a couple of years before the last election, given that business in their engagement with politics could be pretty sure that there was going to be a Labour government after the 2024 election, and that could be seen from quite some distance away, which meant that they were able to engage, and actually the Labour Party in opposition were very good at putting in place formal structures to listen to businesses. Whether those are translated across the government is less certain, but we have now moved into a world where we're having to say to clients, well, in 2024, we woke up and we thought, okay, we know what we're dealing with now. There's a large majority that'll be able to get what they want through. And now, a couple of years later, we're saying, we've got a first past the post system that can't necessarily cope with five-party politics, more than five-party politics when you bring in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And that means that we can't give you certainty. So Emily's point around not trying to predict, but rather trying to prepare is really important as a mindset for public affairs professionals and how they can talk to clients about how they can prepare, but they can't predict. And that means that they need to be ready for lots and lots of different outcomes as part of their planning.
I agree with all of that. The challenge really and the frustration is that people thought this would be a more stable period, probably globally as well. They weren't expecting a conflict in Iran. We knew there was a conflict from Russia invading Ukraine and companies had baked that in. We didn't think there'd be another pandemic. People are worried about things like hantaviruses or Ebola in a way that we perhaps weren't worried about it before we lived through COVID. We have AI and technological changes. So there is a lot of things happening around us already that makes it difficult for national governments to govern, but for global and domestic companies also to pivot and change their business. And this was the part that they thought would be easier to navigate. I would say two tactical things, actually, that companies can do beyond working with a broader and deeper group of political parties and themes. Number one is to remain nimble. So when I worked at Glaxo as their head of government affairs globally, we listed Haleon as a $40 billion company on the London Stock Exchange and had spent 2 years preparing for that listing. The date that we listed was in July 2022, and for those who enjoy politics, that was the week that Boris Johnson's government finally collapsed with 40 resignations. But because we'd worked closely with Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor and his spads, because we'd worked closely with Anne-Marie Trevelyan at political conferences at COP26 and before those, we were able to have both of those ministers come to the listing because they had committed to do so personally as well as in their roles. The fact that they resigned an hour later and supported different candidates didn't have an impact on us. Had they not come, it wouldn't have changed the listing. They were not the keynote speakers, nor had we invited the Prime Minister because at that time we knew that Boris Johnson was in trouble. When I worked for ESPN and the Walt Disney Company as their global head of communications back in 2007 to 2010, we lived through the financial crisis. And for the first 6 months, nobody flew anywhere. We weren't sure where all of our revenue was across the different lines of business. But once we did know that, the company went into an acquiring spree of Marvel and Lucas and Pixar and the English Premier League rights when the previous stakeholder went bankrupt. And because we were nimble and cash rich, actually the crisis became an opportunity. So again, companies will initially look at this as frustrating and difficult, and should we pause things? Actually, in any crisis, there's also an opportunity for businesses that are ready for it.
Do you feel that it's part of your job, part of our industry's job, to focus on that in terms of your internal message to the clients? I mean, effectively, I've been through this kind of turmoil a lot of times. There are upsides, and here might be some of them. Because I could imagine a lot of clients are going to be very anxious in times like this.
So it depends who the client are. I think we have two different sets of clients. One is the people with whom we work on public affairs and corporate affairs, and then we're helping them to build a message for their CEO and C-suite who might be less interested in the day-to-day politics. So it is a message of stability and that we can help them to navigate the changes either geopolitically or domestically. And it is helping to give them examples of where this has worked before. And all of the three agencies in this podcast today have deep clients across different sectors, across different markets, and credentials that can help, I think, reassure the clients to know that they're in safe hands with us. Of course, it's then walking the walk with them, and having some wins with them helps a huge amount. Being able to work through the next few weeks, not just of looking in a fortune teller's glass and trying to predict what will happen, but actually look through things like the King's Speech and work out which bills will work, which ones won't, regardless of who ends up being Prime Minister for the next 3 years. So
in general terms then, how have you found public affairs during the Starmer government versus your expectations, and how much has it changed over the period of the administration so far, would you say? Fraser, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that Labour were very good in opposition about setting up forums for them to listen to and engage with business. I think that was welcome. It was also culturally different from what had gone on before under Jeremy Corbyn, where the vibe towards business had been very obviously different. I think it's very difficult to carry things that are put in place at HQ level within political parties into government, because you then immediately get the civil service taking over responsibility for external engagement, business contact. So I think that was inevitable, that the same structures that they had in place, while they continued them into the business days at party conference, were going to be limited because they had two hats to wear. I think culturally there's a difference between the people within government at political level who are comfortable talking to business, culturally comfortable talking to business, and those who aren't. And I think that there are just slightly fewer people within the Labour government who are naturally inclined to bring business in the way that I think they told business in the run-up to the election that they would be. And I think early on in the genesis of this government, there was a lot of talk around reshaping structures so that you would have businesses actually involved in committees that were going to help set these missions that were going to drive government delivery forward. And that didn't happen. So I think you start to do those things and it just kind of dents confidence in whether you're going to revert to some of the more civil service focused structures of business, which I have to say have been getting better over the years. But it does kind of undermine confidence. And it does also create space for other parties to show that they can do external affairs and business engagement more effectively. So I think actually Reform UK have actually approached external affairs in quite a professional way that I think has forced some of the more establishment parties, if we can call them that, to try and catch up with being as open to business engagement as they have been. So definitely a difference between whether or not people have worked in business and feel comfortable talking to business, whether they delegate some of that to the civil service. But there are clear exceptions, and we've had some good engagement with Number 10. Obviously, they've got people in there at a very senior level who are leading on investment and who've been coordinating on business, being the business point of contact for Number 10. So it's there, but I think there's a natural wariness and natural cautiousness that Labour, I think, made genuine attempts to deal with in opposition, but I don't think that they've carried over into government in the way that we would have hoped, particularly around the start of the government and the way things were framed.
So that's been a similar experience for us. Look, I became a diplomat in 2000 and worked under Blair and Brown and Cameron and May, Johnson, and then left during his tenure before Liz Truss's short period and Rishi Sunak. And working under most of those, I think there were probably 3 areas of overlap for all of them: supporting people and values, supporting prosperity and trade, and supporting peace and security. And on the prosperity and trade part, whether it was Labour or Conservative or the coalition with the Liberal Democrats, they wanted to have more investment into the UK and they wanted to be able to trade more internationally. So our companies knew that it was one of the 3 Ps, one of the 3 priorities of either government in either colour, and they knew how to work through the system. But during that time, there was obvious chaos during Brexit and COVID, which meant that it was more difficult to be able to dock in with people. And so companies and agencies found it more difficult really just to get time with people. So when we met with Kemi Badenoch as Haleon, which had big R&D in the UK, manufacturing in the UK, exporting to 180 markets, the biggest listing on stock exchange for 25 years, it still took us a year to be able to secure a meeting with our CEO because people were jostling for positions within the party. That wasn't the case with Labour in opposition. We were able to meet Johnny Reynolds 4 or 5 times when he was the shadow business secretary. We met with Rachel Reeves a number of times, not just at party conference on their business day. The Prime Minister was very keen to meet with businesses as well and to set up processes for us to be able to dock in from different sectors to be able to advise them on what could be done better. But as Fraser said, it's a challenge when you're running a country, not just because there are civil servants who quite rightly are gatekeepers on what priorities are and are not as important either by sector or employee or driving the economy in a different direction, but also because actually they have to deal with running the NHS and the education system and challenges that might happen to the country externally. The Prime Minister has to travel a lot more than he would have done in opposition. So understandably, it's been more of a challenge. That said, we've found it relatively easy to work with the government. Some things are delegated to DBT, other things are delegated to HMT, depending on the policy. It might be Transport Ministry, it might be the City Minister. It's often centralised and has often been with Prime Ministers in Number 10, so knowing people there is important. The churn has been a surprise. Having 4 city ministers in 2 years is less than ideal. So having another reshuffle and a leadership challenge again is why it's frustrating for business leaders, because they thought there'd be more stability, having met them in opposition and having a 5-year tenure as part of our democracy normally.
So, do you think any of the leadership challenges would be more or less amenable to businesses and to lobbying, in your view?
So look, all of them are going to have to be amenable to business because they all know that we need a stable economy. Already people have seen the gilt prices change in the uncertainty that long-term investors will say, well, I'm not sure if it's the right place for me to invest from the US or China or Northeast Asia or the Middle East, who themselves are going through challenges with the Israel-US-Iran conflict. So it's not the time to have instability. Those, if Burnham is the one that wins and Rayner and Miliband join that side of a more left government, there will be some things that are factored into that change in terms of minimum wage, protection for workers' rights, nationalising utilities. Wes Streeting has already said he wants to have a closer relationship with Europe. All of them say they want a closer relationship with Europe. So what does that actually mean in practice? And then they're also boxed into having a mandate for this election period. They haven't been voted in by the public, and so they are inheriting a lot of things that the Labour Party were able to win a mandate on 2 years ago, and that includes around taxation. And if taxation changes, then it makes them less palatable to be elected. But without that change, then a lot of the social security things that they'd like to change also become difficult. So whoever, if Prime Minister Starmer stays, it's a challenge because he's been weakened and because the party knows that he's a liability when it comes to a general election in 3 years' time. If Andy Burnham wins the local election, which is not a foregone conclusion when we look at what's just happened in the local elections, including in that particular area, then he will have the challenges of being boxed in terms of cost versus what he wants to achieve. And Wes Streeting doesn't currently have the numbers.
I think it's less a question of whether they're amenable to being lobbied and more a question of whether they're amenable to listening. I think one of the things we're talking about culturally is just that there are fewer people now within our modern crop of politicians who have real, genuine experience of business, who understand what it's like to have to deal with the pressures of national insurance rises or additional employment rights being added, and to have to mitigate that and to continually tell the government in advance that if you do this will be the consequence, but not be listened to. So that kind of the question of, are you genuinely listening or are you just being lobbied and then continuing regardless, and potentially with some of these things, but not all U-turning later on. I think that's the key thing. And I don't think that there'll be any enormous difference between the candidates. Some of them will be more naturally pro-business than others, but I think that's the kind of the fundamental cultural question that we have, and the fundamental cultural problem that we have is whether people are genuinely listening to what they're being told about how businesses will react in the real world.
Okay, and just very quickly then, I mean, it was sort of touched upon earlier, but how broadly have you approached the other parties in recent months? I mean, particularly Reform and Greens, given their strength in the pollings.
So we ran an event last week with a Green adjacent think tank because our clients wanted to know a bit more about their policies before the local elections. We've also had meetings with Reform because we've known already about their popularity. And as I said, we'll be going to all of the party conferences. It's important for our clients that we have depth, not just in what were traditionally, at least 2019, 80% of the seats between two big parties, but that we have them across the five main parties in England, and that we have relationships in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, as Fraser and I've said previously. So it's our role to better understand those parties, to better understand their policies, to know who we would work with if they themselves come into government, but also to see what they're doing in the regions where they might already have a mandate and where they have local control over health or education or potholes or transport and things that matter to everyday people outside of the discussion we have in Westminster.
Yeah, and Fraser?
Yeah, I think the other way that we at SEC Newgate are able to approach it is having the local and the national team being able to provide different insight. And I think particularly with the Green Party, but also with Reform from the last local elections, you've suddenly got a load of new councillors on the ground who are making decisions that our local public affairs colleagues are dealing with day in, day out. And that's able to help build a richer picture of what an emerging and a developing party actually looks like, as well as going with the grain of the new structures that a fast-moving startup party like Reform has been creating and trying to engage with and go with the changes in how they're structuring themselves and how they're organising themselves, as well as being able to convene the right people that you need to put businesses, whether it's with the new First Minister, who we did a roundtable with in our offices about a month or so before his election, as Plaid Cymru First Minister. So all of these things matter. It's constantly evolving, but it's about finding new ways to understand new parties, I think.
Great. And final question. If you had to put money on it, maybe this is unfair, how do you think the current crisis will end? Will Starmer last the course, or is change pretty much inevitable now in the near future?
So I work backwards from the position that I think it's unlikely that the Prime Minister leads the Labour Party into the next election, but I think that that's been the position for a number of months before the local elections. I think that was a potential lighting of the touch paper, which hasn't happened quite yet, but has moved things on. So then it just becomes a question of timing. We talked earlier on about the difference between predicting and preparing. I think there's also a danger within people who pay attention to politics quite closely of confirmation bias and thinking that things that happened were inevitable and were always going to happen. So when we're talking to clients about what this could mean, I think we're very careful to say, but there are no guarantees. There are external factors. There are things that could happen. Someone could say something could come out that could change the calculation. Things could happen internationally. And we haven't really felt the full effects of the downstream implications of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz in terms of jet fuel and petrol and fertilizer and what that does to inflation and all these kind of things. So the interaction of all of these things are very messy, and that means it's very difficult to say for certain at the moment, assuming that Andy Burnham can get over the hurdle of the Makerfields by-election, which is a big hurdle. The polls show that he is in pole position to either win a contest against the Prime Minister or to win a contest without the Prime Minister if he stands down. But I think it's very difficult to know with any certainty what's going to happen. So our point around preparing but not predicting is, I think, particularly important.
Great.
I think in answer to that question, we have to step back and try to understand how we got here. Most people didn't vote for Labour because they were in love with Labour. They had a landslide because people were rejecting the end period of the Conservative Party and the chaos that we'd lived through from Brexit to COVID, and after that with 3 prime ministers in quick succession. Some people voted for Keir Starmer because he was a leader who wasn't like the previous 3, but they didn't fall in love with him in terms of his character or charisma then either. And thirdly, the vision of a social democratic party was not really laid out. It was, we're not them and we're stable. And linked to that, the promise of not raising any of the 3 main taxations was supposed to calm the markets, but also calm the voter, because Labour as always lacks confidence that it can win at a general election, and therefore sold that policy down the line, which again is why I said they boxed themselves in terms of change. So if there is a new leader, they can set out change in those areas in terms of a vision and excitement, and try to deal with some of the issues on the left around housing and student loans and fairness and transparency and opportunity, and on the right be tough on illegal migration, which all the parties agree with but has perhaps been articulated differently, and still win the middle part on the economy, which is what most elections are fought on, as well as the national health and education. Who can do that? Well, ironically, we have a situation where the current Prime Minister would prefer Andy Burnham not to come into Parliament because he will be a major challenge to his leadership. At the same time, he can't afford to lose that by-election because it would be dangerous for Labour in the future. So I suspect not only are they tied together, Burnham and Starmer, but they will do everything they can to try and win this local election, which will have national significance.
Okay, thank you for that. And that's all the time we have, unfortunately. Really good conversation. Thanks to you all for some really good insights and for taking part. Unfortunately, due to some technical problems, Emily wasn't able to join us for part of this episode, but we really appreciate her and both of you for giving your insights. So thank you.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.